Okay, thanks everyone. Just a bit of a quick introduction. The Bus Association Victoria are a volunteer member organisation. We have approximately 450 odd members throughout Victoria. A large majority of our members are local, rural and regional school bus operators, but we also represent larger metropolitan and regional centre operators as well. Our role varies from advocacy to accreditation and assistance with compliance. A lot of our members are very small business and multiple business operators in the sense that they run the farm or the local post office as well as a school bus, and that's a very important role. My role is to assist the bus industry to come to terms with this idea of land use and transport integration. It's a fairly new concept for a lot of the operators. My background is in strategic planning, economics and demographics. So I come at transport planning from a slightly different perspective in that I tend to look at the bigger picture, and the presentation I've got today is really presenting some high-level concepts and ideas based on observations that we're seeing in terms of growth and demographics and I suppose regional economics as well. So today I want to quickly run through the role and function of road-based public transport, elaborate a bit more on the hierarchy of services, provide you with a bit of strategic context, and then talk a little bit about transport and productivity as a concept of moving away from this idea that investment in freight is the key to having more productive roads. And I think what I'm talking about there is if we can move more people on mass transit, we'll achieve better efficiencies in freight. I'm going to provide you with a big audacious idea, and you can see there regional development commissions is something that we don't have here in Victoria. And then I want to talk a little bit about integrated land use and transport planning. So the role and function. In my role, we really sort of talk about there being almost 4 tiers of transport, and that is community transit, which is around social inclusion, and that's linking people who don't have the ability to provide their own private transport options to important things like shops and health services and things like that. We then have local employment services where it's really about connecting people from home to work and back again. And wrapped up in that is the town school services, which is again meeting student demand, and that's really important. We also see that intermodal connection is very important, and that's about connecting people within the region and also outside the region. And then V-line coaches are another important service that extend beyond the immediate region. In terms of a hierarchy of services, we're just elaborating a bit more on the 3 tiers that Stuart and Catherine were talking about. Is that the local neighbourhood service levels? To us, that's a minimum service level. Typically, it's about 1 to 2 services an hour, a relatively short span of hours, and most services in regional areas operate at that level at the moment. The next level down, which we consider to be good to excellent services, is around 2 to 3 services an hour, and that's more about connecting neighbourhoods to town centre, and it's that intermodal connector as well. And then an optimum service level is where we start to get into this idea of having fast, direct, highly frequent routes that connect people from a fixed point and operate more like a rail on road or a tram service. Smart Bus in Melbourne is that sort of service, and I think that a few of those strategically located around Bendigo would be a massive advantage. That's just a bit of a picture of the existing bus network in the context of the rail around Bendigo at the moment. You can see it's spread out quite extensively, and I think it's a good network that gets a lot of coverage. I won't dwell on that too long. Okay, patronage. So patronage is going really well in regional areas. This is taken from the quarterly official patronage series that PTV publish, and this is the December results, and we can see there that, if I can get this pointer to work. I might just point to it. This is my analogue pointer. We've got last quarter we had growth of 3.6%. Sorry.
I know I wasn't supposed to ask questions, but are these touch on and touch offs?
It's based on, and PTV can perhaps elaborate this. It's based on a combination of observation and touch on, touch off data. But you can see there that the results are good. It's trending above the long-term forecast, and the stats there on that little dropout box are it increased by 3.1% in the 12 months ending December 2013. So we think that that's a good result, and you can see there that the other modes have decreased marginally. And just by contrast, or to give some context, the increase in bus patronage is trending well across metropolitan Melbourne as well, and you can see there that we've had a dip, but now I think you can see there that the it's trending back towards averaging above the long-term forecast, even though it's below it at the moment. Okay, so some interesting demographics, and this is really just to give some context around the type of population that we're planning public transport for. I know that there's probably a plethora of information around the demographics and more detail than what I've got here, but it certainly informed my thoughts on ITLIS. So I'll go back to slide. Just to give you some context there, growth of 1.3% for a regional area I think is pretty good. When you think about what drives population growth in a regional centre, it's mostly about in-migration, which is to do with jobs. So I think that's a pretty good sign for Bendigo and the surrounding area, that there's confidence in jobs growth, and given what we're seeing in other parts of the state with job losses, I think that this is it's a good sign. The really interesting part of that demographic growth, though, is in the change in household structure, and so we're seeing a fairly significant change from household with children to couple-only and single-person households, and that's important because it links to the ageing profile of the region. And you can see there that 29% and 30% respectively for those two categories or cohorts is quite significant compared to the family households, and that really goes towards thinking about what sort of housing market we want to stimulate in Bendigo in terms of how do we supply housing that meets that. At the moment, I think it's probably fair to say that the majority of housing is being supplied in detached family housing. To me, suggests that there's a need for more higher density. Going to the ageing profile, you can see that there's quite significant increase, and part of the explanation of that previous slide is to understand what's going on with this ageing profile, and you can see there that by 2030, Gen X, which is sort of my generation, will be sort of pushing 60 odd. Poor old baby boomers are sort of starting to dwindle off there at 80 odd, but I bet they're still rocking out to Neil Young. But they're still forming a greater and higher proportion of the population, which from a transport perspective is really important, because we want to make sure that our public transport services are able to keep those people connected in their communities. I also had young professionals at 40, just to make me feel a little bit better. So, but the interesting part of that demographic towards the end of that slide is the ageing households, and a very important part of that in the context of public transport is the proportion of female in the population at that point, simply because they live longer and their needs to connect into the community is probably a bit greater. And I've really just summed up those comments there with some transport comments in relation to that previous slide, and I think these 3 points really drive home the point of that is that social exclusion is a real problem, particularly in regional areas. if we don't supply the right sort of public transport services, we'll have a greater number of older drivers on the road, and that increases the risk of road trauma, not just for the people around the older drivers, but for the drivers themselves. And every couple of weeks or so, you see a report of an older driver hitting the wrong pedal and going the wrong way into a shop front or a swimming pool, which is not necessarily a good thing. Yes, true. But that's also a good point, that if you go back a couple of those other slides, and I'll just... The youth area is also an important part of that demographic, in that proportion of population is something that we need to be planning for over the next 20, 30 years, in that having services that support their ability to get around is also an important part of that. So really, there's not much difference in terms of need. That this group are a lot more independent in terms of their ability to get around. Employment profile is another important factor that I've looked at here, and Bendigo is changing. I was a bit disappointed with ABS in that they changed the categories, so I couldn't get 2001 census data to match up, so I couldn't compare apples with apples. But just between 2006 and 2011, professionals were the only employment category that actually increased in change. Now, I probably need to look into that a bit further to see whether there was some other things included into that professional category, but on the coalface, it looks to be a shift in the way people are working. The other really interesting part of this is the growth in community and personal services, and that's probably to do with the ageing population and the shift from the growth in the demand for personal services and things like that. So, interestingly, I just remembered an important fact. In the intergenerational report put out by the federal government in 2010 had the cost of ageing population as something like 3 times the amount of the cost of global warming in terms of cost to the economy. Yet the focus is on the climate change, which is fair enough, but I think perhaps we need to start looking at how we continue to function as a society with an ageing population, because it takes a long time to reverse. Bendigo is a regional city. I think the regional growth plans, to me, set up a really great opportunity to start to restructure how we plan around our regions, and I think Bendigo as a regional city was a bit of a no-brainer. I think you only need to look at the services and facilities here and the critical mass of population. It really does have that central hubbing role, and I think one of the things that I would like to see ITLA's focus on is developing it, using this as the framework to set itself up into the future to really give effect to some of those higher level objectives in the regional growth plan. And an important one there is planning for higher frequency services to change travel habits, as PTV have alluded to. From a land use planning perspective, this is something that I sort of talk about a bit in that and this is right across any metropolitan city. It's not exclusive to Victoria or Melbourne, but the lag in public transport provision is a real issue. It takes sometimes 5 to 6 years to get services into a new subdivision, and I think if we're planning good communities, like in Melbourne, the Growth Areas Authority went to a lot of trouble to build growth area precinct structure planning guidelines and put a lot of effort into making sure that the urban design part of those plans was really good, but then there was no follow-up with terms of making sure that we had public transport provision in sooner. And I think going to PTV's point, that the importance of getting services into new subdivisions sooner is something that I'd like to see more of a focus on, obviously notwithstanding the budget constraints. And that's just a bit more on that in that, what have I said there? So this is really talking about making sure that I suppose the land use side of ITLIS concentrates a greater proportion of new housing into infill areas, and I think that's an important point to think about how that relates back into the planning scheme around supporting the housing market to be able to deliver higher density forms of housing. And it doesn't necessarily mean central equity style towers, but it just means high quality, good quality, well located, high density housing, which allows people to make a proper choice. And that's also important from a regional city point of view when people are making choices about where to live. I encountered this a fair bit in Western Australia, where I did some work in Geraldton. Geraldton's about 4 hours drive north of Perth, and about a half-hour flight from Perth Airport. People who were working in Geraldton were making the decision that it was easy for them to fly in and fly out on a daily basis or a weekly basis, because Geraldton didn't have the services that would allow them to have the same quality of lifestyle that they can have in Perth. So it's really important for those regional centres to focus on putting in or developing the livability factors that make it easier for a person to say, I can have just as good as lifestyle, if not better, in that centre than I could in Melbourne or the capital city. And I think that's something that the ITLIS should keep in mind at the top of its agenda there. Some observations around things that impact on the ability to supply, some PT challenges, and reflecting on that earlier point about growth areas. They typically have low levels of activity, which make it hard to find attractors to put public transport into as services, even though we all say that they're needed. Delayed road and intersection construction make it difficult to get buses into new growth areas where you've got a stretch of 800 metres or a kilometre of unmade road that's in the structure plan and ready to go, but the funds haven't been collected, or you've got a developing landowner that's not ready to go for another 3 years. So there's coordination and sequencing. Low density housing make it difficult to get critical mass in, and sometimes subdivision design and layout, and also sequencing can make it difficult as well. High levels of car ownership. I know in Melbourne, in the outer areas of Melbourne, households are now starting with 2 cars. It's not even a case of buying the second car when they realise that they're not getting public transport. They're starting with 2 cars. So that high level of car ownership is a major detractor from public transport demand, because the car's there, it's on demand, it goes where you want it to. And from a choice point of view, it's easier to pick up the keys and jump in the car. In some cases, existing routes are infrequent and indirect, and sometimes inaccessible. And PTV touched on this earlier, is that walkability is a really important part of increasing demand for public transport. If you've got good walkable destinations and cycling, it just makes your choices of mode become a lot better. And I know for myself, I live in Brunswick. Driving's my last choice. I'll either walk, ride, or get on a tram or a bus before I jump in the car, and it's usually only to go on a longer trip. So I think that they're really important. The reverse of that, in terms of improving the ability to supply, and here's a bit of an idea, I think new statutory requirements for service provision. So if there were, similar to sewerage schemes or water schemes, if we had some sort of a user pays contribution scheme that was alongside a statutory requirement to get services into an area within 2 or 3 years of a certain number of lots coming online, I think that would be a good starting point, because it would give, I guess, a sense of urgency and a target to aim for. You may not get it 100% of the time, but it would sort of, I think, help with that. Better coordination of intersection construction, and I think ITLIS is a good opportunity to set out a broad structure for Bendigo to make sure that land use and transport integration is occurring. Statutory provisions that support higher density housing, making it easier for developers to get their approvals is also fairly important, because that then allows that housing market to evolve naturally. Things that improve patronage, and you can see it there, developing highly integrated and coordinated modal network. PTV have talked about that, and I think it's a really good objective and an initiative that's an ongoing thing. Developing a network of functioning hierarchies, again, that's the same thing, and improves on-road priority. I think and it's probably not such an issue here in Bendigo, but where you've got road congestion and a bus speeding past you, or even a cyclist speeding past you, you really start to think, what am I sitting in this car for? I should be on that bus. And real-time arrivals information, knowing when your bus is arriving, where it's going, it's just so critical and it's been such Tram Tracker has been such an advantage for tram users in Melbourne. I just can't talk enough about that, I think. And the technology is not that difficult now. I think Google are working on a system at the moment that would allow something like that to occur fairly freely and easily. So the technology's there, we just need to tap into it. Nearly finished. Cities with high rankings of livability have one thing in common, and it's good public transport. And I snapped this in Ho Chi Minh City last year when I was there, and it just really summed up to me that this is really what we want to try and avoid, and I really felt sorry for that poor bus stuck there in amongst it all. Just a bit of academic stuff. The Mercer Quality of Living Survey showed that Australian capital cities are slipping down their ranking of livability, and they're being replaced by cities that have made substantial investments in transport infrastructure. Stanley argued that from a land transport perspective, that the top issues affecting livability are traffic congestion, and it still staggers me. $10 billion a year annually, and it's increasing to 20 in productivity costs. That's nationally, I've got the breakdown for Victoria, but it just seems to me that we talk so much about wages and cost of living and all of that sort of stuff, but yet there's nothing being done about congestion as a cause of business productivity loss. Greenhouse gas emissions. 90% of that 15% comes from road-based transport, so that's a fairly significant factor. Serious road trauma, we lose 1,300 lives every year on the roads. Social exclusion, 27% of households are ineligible to drive, and that's made up of people under the age of 18, people with disabilities, and people over the age of 75 or 80 who start to lose their ability to drive and their independence. Obesity is another major one. 52% of women, 67% of men, and 25% of children are considered overweight or obese. And in the context of that, the average car trip in Melbourne involves 8 minutes of walking. A PT trip would involve 5 times it, so on average 40 minutes a day, just walking to and from public transport, and I think that brings it into the context of active transport. And then energy security, my logo sort of gets in the way there, but our self-sufficiency on transport fuel is dropping to 20% by 2020, or 2030. So, and that's quite significant. That has an impact on fuel prices. Just a bit of triple bottom line. I quite like this slide because it really sort of sums up the benefits of investment in public transport. Fewer cars on the road. Glenn made the point about how many cars a bus will take off the road. Depends on whether he's going flat chat or not, and it stops at the lights. But chronic, you can see there. I won't read through it all, but those benefits go down the pages as well as across the page in their categories. So that's just something to think about there for a moment. And I touched on this a bit earlier, but implicitly what John Stanley was talking about was job security and jobs growth. If we can do everything we can to make our regional businesses more sustainable and productive, then it makes it, I think it's really important for retaining meaningful employment in our regions. So, for a big audacious idea, regional development commissions, something that's worked really well in Western Australia for a long time, and the idea is that you have, within a region, you have a committee of local governments that coordinate economic development and investment in a region, and it's based on strategic planning. So where there's been a plan done that is coordinated through that, that we've got the regional growth plans. Granted, the one for this region is still in draft form, but it probably won't change that much. And I think it's something that we should really consider here in Victoria, because it's a way of sort of helping that region to deliver its and fulfil its true potential. A new governance structure could fall out of that, which would allow regional public transport to be coordinated at the local level with more local input, and it sort of looks a little bit like this. So the idea being that PTV or state government have an overseeing role in terms of funding and ticketing and policy development, but the responsibility for service supply, staging and infrastructure coordination would sit with the Regional Development Commission, local government, with input from the service operators. At the bottom-up level, you have various agencies like Vic Roads, DSE, DTPLI having input also with community stakeholder input, and so that the idea being that rather than things or services being developed at a level where there are minor adjustments needed, that it would be allowed to occur because the funding would be sitting there and it's working within your set budget. So, and I've sort of labelled that as regional self-determination. Bit bolshy, I know, but so in conclusion, ITLAs should support the housing strategy to facilitate a market for a high-quality, high-density housing in appropriate locations. It should also guide the development of a PT network that supports the needs of the changing demographics. Importantly, access for youth, I think, is a critical thing, particularly for weekend and after-school employment, where the ability of, say, someone to have a job at the supermarket or Target after school or on the weekends, and their ability to get there independently, particularly in a regional area, is really important, because it adds to the economy, it adds to the social value of the region. Access for seniors with limited mobility and high quality services capable of effecting mode shift for work trips. At a higher level, I think it should also set short, medium and long-term objectives for a high-quality public transport and sustainable growth of the region. And it should both be informed and inform an employment and industrial land use strategy designed to make it easier for businesses to survive and to thrive in the region. So that's me. Thanks.